Welcome to ECU 402 Macroeconomics. Study Section 1, General Introduction. The concept of microeconomics should not be new at this stage given your previous knowledge about the subject matter in the last three sessions. In the previous study of microeconomics, we understand that the major concern of microeconomics is how to achieve sustainable output level, stable inflation, minimum unemployment, high productivity of factors, consistent and sound functioning of the financial system, and continuous improvement in the balance of payments. However, hardly can any economy in the world achieve these aims simultaneously. Another issue is that it is yet unclear why growth rate, inflation rate, and unemployment rate differ across countries. In the US, the authorities were not at ease in the 1990s when the economy was doing fine because it could be followed by economic downturn in the near future. Their thought was right because in the 2000s and even up till now, the economy has been experiencing hard times. In Europe, the authorities worried about the high unemployment rate which refused to slow down despite all reforms. Furthermore, some fast-growing Asian economies such as China, Japan, Korea, and Singapore were affected by Asia's economic crisis in the 1990s and global financial crisis in 2008. In Africa, economic growth appears to be a Herculean task for the authorities, and global financial crisis that metamorphosed into economic crisis negotiated away the hard-earned growth of the 2000s. Why are economies of the world facing a series of economic problems? The answer is not straightforward, but what is clear is that the performance of any economy can be examined through the behavior of macroeconomic indicators such as inflation and unemployment. In most cases, when one indicator of economic performance is doing fine, the other tends to be affected either negatively or positively. For example, when unemployment is too low, microeconomists will complain because too low unemployment tends to generate high inflation. An attempt to curb inflation rate will lead to high unemployment. Thus, when the authorities are trying to curb unemployment, microeconomists will complain about its concomitant inflation effect. Why is this so? Reduction in unemployment will lead to increase in wages. Increase in wages will lead to high cost of production, and high cost of production will lead to increase in price level and hence inflation rate. However, it must be noted that it is not in all cases that low unemployment leads to high inflation rate. In a case where the power of the labor union is very strong such that they force industries to pay high wages, there will be both inflation and unemployment. Conversely, if the power is weak such that they cannot influence high wage, reduction in unemployment may not necessarily reduce inflation. Another important indicator of economic performance is the stock market behavior. Increase in stock market price signals to investors to make more profit by buying more stocks even at high price. Thus, increase in stock price leads to increase in corporate profit and hence economic growth. But high stock price by excessive opportunism tend to generate sudden fall. This is exactly what happened in the US in 2007, which became a global financial crisis. This again shows that high stock price may be a signal to economic slowdown. In Nigeria and other economies, economic growth is not stable over time. For instance, in the 1980s and 1990s, Nigeria experienced economic downturn. Except for 1985 and also 1990, there was no year the country experienced 5% growth. In 2000s, the growth rate hovered around 6%, an indication that the dismal performance of the economic in the 1980s and 1990s was overtaken by economic improvement in the later years. Unfortunately, the economy could not sustain this level of growth until 2010. The growth rate actually plummeted, and it is unclear whether the economic growth rate will increase or fall in the subsequent year. What is clear is that the country failed to sustain the 6% economic growth of the 2000s. Yet, there is another economic indicator, in this case, inequality. Economists argue that inequality can be used to measure economic performance. One school of thought argues that large inequality may not likely be bane of economic performance, while the other believe that large disparity between the rich and the poor tends to worsen economic performance. Workers with less education earn very low salary. Decline in economic growth and increase in wage inequality will lead to absolute wage decline. Where does increased wage inequality come from? Economists suggest that international trade and technological advancement are the likely channels. The argument is that due to international trade, goods that can be produced locally using unskilled workers are imported from abroad, and this tends to reduce wages in this sector. Wages of highly skilled workers such as engineers, doctors, etc. are on the increase because, first, they tend to compete favorably internationally, and second, they export such goods abroad. New technology requires the need for highly skilled workers. Hence, demand for highly skilled workers increases while that of unskilled workers falls. What is not clear is whether the international trade channel of wage inequality is more pressing than that of technological advancement. All these explanations lead to some questions that this course seeks to provide answers to. These questions are: what determines expansion and recession in a particular economy? Why did Nigeria have so long recession followed by relatively brief expansion? What role do fiscal and monetary policies play in an economy? Why is inflation so high in the 1990s and relatively low in the 2000s? Is inflation good or bad? Should countries target inflation or reduce it to zero? Is it possible to have zero inflation rate? Could Nigerians' unemployment fall? And if it could, by how much? Why do countries in Africa experience high unemployment rate relative to the advanced countries? Why do growth rates differ across countries and over long period of time? For instance, why is China growing so much faster than the US? Why did China growth rate overtake Japan even though they are both Asia countries and China is a latecomer? What are the sources of economic growth? What are the interactions between stock market, the foreign exchange market, and economic activities? In order to answer these questions successfully, we collapse the economic event into three, namely the short run, the medium run, and the long run. The first 5 chapters discuss the short run, and in the process, we discussed the roles of fiscal and monetary policies and what they are capable of doing in the short run. From chapter 6 to 9, we examined the economy in the medium run. This analysis enables us to explore into the connection between inflation and unemployment. We provide also answers to when and how reduction in inflation will lead to relatively low unemployment rate. The last chapters cover the economy in the long run. We also included economic dynamics and openness. It is our view that by the time you complete reading this material, you will have a completely different thinking about how an economy works, and you should be able to participate actively in any debate that has to do with macroeconomics, particularly in the case of Nigeria. To be well connected with this course, you need a refresher in economics mathematics, particularly the calculus aspect of it. However, we simplified our mathematical specification in order to make it reader-friendly. Before we proceed to tackling the listed questions, it is important to intimate readers with some macroeconomic terms. We begin by conceptualizing gross domestic product (GDP). Nominal GDP is defined as the monetary value of all goods and services that a country produces irrespective of ownership or factor of production in a period, usually a year. The hypothetical table below shows how nominal GDP is calculated. The nominal GDP continues to increase over the years. A close inspection of the table shows that as output was increasing, so also was general price level. In terms of output, the economy was doing good, but in terms of increase in price, the welfare of the people tends to fall. To calculate the real performance of the economy, we need to remove the influence of price changes. When we remove this influence, we arrive at real GDP, RGDP. Thus, RGDP is defined as changes in output over time. In the table above, output rose to 120 in 2008 from 100 in 2007. The percentage change in output, therefore, was 20%. In 2009, the volume of output was 130, up from 120 in 2008, thereby recording 8% change in output. Thus, the economy has done relatively well in terms of output in 2008 compared to 2009. Real GDP can also be defined as a product of current output and common price, usually called the base year price. Thus, if we take 2008 as a base year, we can compute real GDP for 2007, 2008, and 2009 by multiplying the output of each year by the price that prevailed in the base year, in this case 2008. This is demonstrated below. The real GDP computation shows that the economy was increasing, but not as much as the picture painted in the nominal GDP table. Meanwhile, the percentage change in RGDP was 20% and 8% for 2008 and 2009 respectively. This tells us that if we use the changes in output or use common price, we get the same percentage change. Note that if we use another price, we will get different RGDP, but the percentage change remains the same. The major problem in constructing RGDP and GDP is that we have millions of final goods and competing dates series is not a simple task. Another problem is the changes in relative price. The RGDP is sometimes called GDP in terms of goods and services, GDP in constant currency, GDP inflation adjusted, etc. When we write YT, we are referring to GDP at year T. GDP growth rate is computed using the following formula, where YT-1 is the GDP in previous years. If the solution value of the equation is positive, we say the economy experiences growth expansion, and if it is negative, it is called growth decay. Thus, we use the above equation to examine how the economy is performing within a given period of time. Other variables that can be used to measure the performance of the economy are the unemployment rate and inflation rate. Unemployment rate is defined as the ratio of the number of unemployed to the labor force. The formula for calculating unemployment rate is given as, where mu is the unemployment rate, u is the people unemployed, and l is the labor force comprises those employed and those unemployed. Thus, if n represents those with gainful employment and u represents those not employed, then equation 2.2 can be written as, Okun-Otor was the first scholar to establish the relationship between unemployment and GDP growth. According to the scholar, rising unemployment is an indicator of low economic performance, while declining unemployment rate signals to economic expansion. How tenable is Okun's law as far as Nigerian economy is concerned? To answer this question, we examine output growth of our economy and also the corresponding unemployment rate within a given period of time, say a decade or 2 decades. This is presented in figure 2.1 below. In the early 2000s, when there was recession, unemployment rate was also reducing. However, in the mid-2000s and afterwards, it was discovered that as the economy was growing steadily, unemployment rate was declining. It should be noted that between 2004 and 2008, the behavior of economic growth and unemployment reflected the Okun's law, that is, as the economy experienced growth expansion, unemployment fell considerably. Thus, we can conjecture that since the last decade, the economy of Nigeria satisfies the Okun's law. The GDP growth rate and unemployment produce macroeconomists with a signal to where the economy stands and what growth rate might be desirable. Inflation is defined as sustained rise in the general price level. Inflation rate is the rate at which the price level increases. Two measures of inflation are prominent in the literature. These are the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index (CPI). GDP deflator gives the average price of the goods and services included in GDP produced, and it is calculated as a ratio of nominal current GDP to GDP of the same year, that is, where NGDP-T is the nominal GDP at year T and RGDP-T is real GDP at year T. From this equation, it is possible to compute RGDP-T if we know PT and NGDP-T. The point we need to establish here is that if NGDP-T rises faster than RGDP-T, then it is the case that PT has risen. If you want to calculate inflation rate using GDP deflator, we simply compute the growth rate of PT over time. For instance, if you take 2 years, say 2009 and 2010, and let the GDP deflator of 2009 be P09 and that of 2010 be P10, inflation rate in 2010 is calculated as. Generally, inflation rate is calculated using the formula. The second method used to compute inflation rate is the CPI. CPI is used when we focus attention on the purchasing power of consumers. In this case, we assume that consumers are not concerned about goods produced but are concerned about the average price of goods they consume. We need to emphasize the fact that consumers in this case only refer to the household, not government or firms. Also, we should note that foreign-produced imported goods are contained in the consumption basket of the household. Thus, CPI is the index of weighted prices of all goods and services consumed by household irrespective of where the goods are produced, and it is calculated using equation 2.6. That is, the sum of all prices of goods and services computed in a particular year divided by that which prevailed in the base year. That is, the sum of all prices of goods and services computed in a particular year divided by that which prevailed in the base year. Thus, if the sum of prices in a particular year rises faster than the base year, CPI will rise. To compute inflation rate, we now calculate the rate of change of CPI as follows. The higher the value of IT, the higher the inflation rate. Higher inflation rate is an indication that either output cannot keep pace with demand or cost of production is too high. The government of a country where inflation is very high is said to have lost macroeconomic control of the economy. In order to have control over inflation, some countries tend to target inflation rate and ensure that it does not exceed a given bound. Meanwhile, whether inflation is good or bad, take two, for the economy is debatable. In fact, some economists argue that inflation rate is growth enhancing, particularly in the medium run. In a way, not all-time economists care about inflation. Inflation becomes a serious problem if it is not pure inflation. Pure inflation is where all prices, output and input rise proportionately. The reason for this is that pure inflation leaves income distribution unaffected, and so no real problem exists. Inflation becomes worrisome
when prices adjust disproportionately such that income distribution is affected markedly. For example, if output price rises by 50% while wages of skilled workers rises by 50%, but that of unskilled workers remain unchanged or rise by say 10%. In this case, unskilled workers' purchasing power has fallen while that of entrepreneur and skilled workers remains the same and so making the former worse off. End of study section 1. Thanks for listening.